Do we accomplish more if we're always doing something, or does inactivity also serve a purpose? Take a position on this question. Support your response with reasons and specific examples. That was the prompt our English department gave to each 11th grade student in our school as a writing pre-assessment in September of 2013. It was drawn from our state's end-of-course writing test bank. After 20 years of teaching high school English, I thought I knew exactly how my students would respond to that prompt. From my 68 students who took the assessment, I was expecting 68 essays. I was mostly right. I got 67 essays. One of my students had written a screenplay. It featured an unhappily married couple, a workaholic husband who routinely clocked 60 or more hours a week at the office, leaving his wife at home, alone, with nothing to do. Eventually, he commits a white-collar crime. The final scene finds him in a jail cell, alone, with nothing to do. It was the most exciting, well-written piece of the stack. And while the student hadn't written an explicit thesis statement, she had answered the question about whether we should always be doing something. The screenplay argued for a balance between action and inaction. We'd be tempted to ask why that one student wrote a creative response, but we would do better to ask, why didn't anyone else? Why, if the prompt asked for a response, not an essay, did the vast majority of my students default to writing essays? Most of the class hadn't considered the possibility of a creative response in response to a standardized writing prompt, but the student who had inspired them. Her writing gave them permission and encouragement to consider other possibilities beyond the essay. In December, we tried it again. For our midterm assessment, we again gave each student a writing prompt drawn from our state's end-of-course writing test bank. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." Do you agree or disagree with Emerson's statement about individuality? You have to admit, there would be a certain irony in insisting that all students, in responding to a prompt about Emerson and individuality, must all respond in the same genre, that they all must write essays. Imagine that scenario. Imagine a student gets that prompt and thinks about it. Can I write a poem? No. Emerson was a poet. Yes, but he was mostly an essayist. Write an essay. Emerson also wrote, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." That doesn't sound like Emerson. Siri will be the judge of that, young man. And in the meantime, do you want to see an assistant principal? I hope the irony wouldn't be lost on those students, especially if some of the creative writing they had read that year in English class, Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, and the poetry of Emily Dickinson all provided their own answers to that prompt. This time, the majority of the responses I received were not essays. They were poems, plays, short stories, fictional narratives, satires, diary entries, interviews. And these creative writings were more focused, insightful, powerful, and complex than the essays that had preceded them. Was there a connection between the creative writing and complex thinking my students produced? In writing free verse poems, some students were already a far distance from the rigid thinking and structure of a 5-paragraph essay. By focusing on central protagonists, students were able to achieve thoughtful depth over superficial breadth. In writing fiction, students were able to develop and address counterarguments through dialogue between foils, and ironically, the fiction from the second round seemed to reflect the real world more accurately than the nonfiction from the first. My students and I began to wonder if we might replicate those successes on our state's actual end-of-course writing test. Would they be required to write essays? What constitutes an essay anyway? Essay has multiple definitions, one of which is a short literary composition on a particular theme or subject, usually in prose. One-act plays, poems, and short stories all qualify as short literary compositions, and the fact that essays are usually in prose means that some essays are not in prose, that a poem could be reasonably defined as an essay. David Mikix points out that in French, essayer means to try something out. In its root sense, an essay is an attempt, a trial. an experiment. Then we started looking more closely at the state's writing prompts. All of them asked for responses, not essays. All of the online anchor papers were conventional essays, but just because we hadn't seen any creative responses among them, did that mean it wasn't possible or permissible to write one? As a class, we began to weigh the consequences. If students were to fail the test for writing creatively, they would be placed in remediation and would have to take the test again. I have to admit, I was immensely curious to see how some of the best writers I had seen in my career would be remediated. How do you remediate a creative writer? How do you do that? Boys and girls, silence your cell phones and turn off your imaginations. Could you please stop being so creative? Could you be more formulaic? Your writing is too good. Could you make it worse, less interesting? It's making your English teacher feel insecure about his own writing. How do we reduce the creative impulse in a student? We could force them to watch about 30 hours of cable television. It would put a dent in it. How about 12 years of standardized multiple choice tests? I did say to my class, listen, if you fail this test for writing creatively, remember, we live near Washington, D.C. This area has the highest concentration of lawyers in the universe. Half of you out there has at least one parent who's a lawyer. We'll file a class action lawsuit on behalf of creative writers everywhere. You could move forward with legal action if you had answered the question, followed the directions, and satisfied all the requirements of the scoring rubric. Of my 68 students who took the 2014 Virginia end-of-course writing test, 33 of them wrote creative responses. And all 33 of those students passed advanced, some with perfect scores. Encouraged by those results, several writers went on to write creative responses to the SAT writing section. One student wrote her response in the voice of Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye. Another wrote a short story about himself taking the SAT, a meta-response. Another crafted a short story about a husband who reconfigures his work-life balance in the wake of his wife's death. All of those students received nearly perfect scores, and it's worthwhile to point out that the SAT writing section does explicitly ask for an essay. I am waiting for one of my students to commit the hyper-ironic act of responding to the poetry free response section of the Advanced Placement English Literature exam with a poem of her own. What would happen to her? What would happen if she were to thoroughly, thoughtfully, knowledgeably answer the question that was given to her in heartbreakingly beautiful, spring-water clear, mechanically sound verse? It takes courage to write an alternate vision to the conventional wisdom of teachers, tutors in the test prep industry, to instead follow one's own sense of what good writing can be, to turn the tables on the test makers by returning a series of questions. Are some genres more valuable than others? Why would my teacher spend an entire year having me read novels, plays, poems, and short stories, only to test me exclusively on my ability to write a conventional essay, to forbid me from writing creatively myself? Is creative writing only for smart people, like the great authors, and not for me? What place does creativity have in the advanced placement program? How free is the free response section? How advanced is advanced placement? Now, some might say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. If standardized tests want conventional essays, give them conventional essays. But as far as writing is concerned, what gets tested gets taught. We cannot complain about mediocrity in our schools if we will, at best, teach to the middle of Bloom's taxonomy. We cannot wring our hands over our economic future wondering how we will innovate and develop entrepreneurs if we discourage creativity and reasonable risk-taking in our young people. Creativity can be taught. It's not a fixed ability. It can, it must be cultivated in our schools. Maybe Emerson was right. Maybe being yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else really is the greatest accomplishment, even greater than a perfect test score.